This video includes mentions of suicide and physical and mental abuse. If at any point you have to step away from this content, please do so and return when you feel it is safe for you to come back. Your own health and safety comes first. Geb, overlord of his namesake nation. Necromancer. Tyrant. A man who has transcended death in his quest for ever-increasing power and defiance of mortal restraints. A ghost on the throne of a nation where the quick and the dead mingle, Geb has been a driving force in the dynamics that shape the history of the impossible lands. In his long existence, Geb did not only shed the mortal coil, but also virtue and morality. His road to his current position is paved with corpses and sacrifices. This is the story of this necromancer, this lord of blood and bone, this spectral sovereign of a state built on the dead and dark magic. This is the story of Geb. Geb's story begins in -1140 AR. Born as the younger son of a powerful noble family, Geb's early life would be shaped by the political turmoil of his home nation Osirian. Since the death of the 4 pharaohs of Ascension, Osirian had been in a slow state of decline, losing influence in its southern reaches and falling victim to internal political power plays. During the rise of Pharaoh Kenaton, Geb's family was one of those who resisted the new pharaoh's ascendancy to the throne, which would put them on the losing side of history. Once Kenaton had claimed rulership, he showed no mercy to his enemies. Driven by the intent to create stability in Osirian, Kenaton had most of his foes killed or even buried alive. Geb was one of the few, perhaps even the only, member of his family to escape this fate, as he fled to the city of Meketar in Osirian's southern reaches. One can only imagine the havoc such events wreak on the psyche of a young mind, and how they planted the seed for vengeance in Geb's heart. This thirst for revenge probably was a driving factor behind the young wizard's urge to expand his skills, but one might also argue that Geb was born with a hunger for knowledge and, through it, power. The combination of both facets, along with his natural talents for the arcane and occult, were fuel to the fires of his ambition. While in Osirian, Geb had already studied as a wizard and mortuary priest. In his exile in Meketar, he continued to learn more about magic that transcends the threshold between life and death. Not much is known about the exact nature of his early studies within this field, but in -1108 AR, 11 years after fleeing Osirian, he decided to show his acquired mastery in a spectacular way. During an audience with the provincial governor of Meketar, Geb politely requested to be made king. When the governor obviously laughed at that ridiculous request, Geb pulled the governor's soul out of his living body. Immediately after, Geb crowned himself ruler of his own fledgling nation, which would come to bear his name, and so Geb the exiled royalty became Geb the Necromancer King. Under his lordship, the nation of Geb would slowly conquer parts of Osirian's southern reach. Around the same time, the Archmage Nex conquered the city of Quantium, Oenopion, and Ecanas, and would become the second powerful wizard within the Impossible Lands to claim rulership of his own nation. The exact relationship between Geb and Nex is unknown, and many are wary to discuss it in public, or even in the presence of the Ghost King to this day. What we do know is that in the early days of their respective nations, these two wizards shared cordial, diplomatic, and outright friendly communications. For both of them, it must have been a blessing to find an equal in their field, someone who understands the intricacies of their arcane insights and who might offer perspectives either of them had not considered before. In another life, Geb and Nex could have forged a friendship on this anvil of common expertise, perhaps even found love in their mutual passion for the secrets of the arcane. In another life, their two nations could have become allies in a grand endeavor to bring magical innovations to Garund and, one day, all of Golarion. In another life, things could have been beautiful. This, however, is not the story of that other life. With their ambitions growing, Nex and Geb would come into conflict over their nation's expansions, and their personal egos would clash as they worked to always outdo the other in regards to arcane marvels and ideas. When neither nation could grow without these tensions escalating, the legendary 1,000-year war between Nex and Geb began. And a full list of all atrocities committed during this era would break the scope of this chronicle. For Geb, this war must have been more than a show of the strength of his nation. In this conflict, he was in direct opposition to the only person of his time who could rival him. Nex was the only wizard on all of Golarion that could stand against his power, and the fact that there were still people out there who could defeat Geb, who could work wonders greater than the ones he could conceive, was not an insult to the necromancer king. It was exhilarating, life-giving, and purpose-defining. Of what consequence was the land their war ravaged, the people their war displaced and harmed, the atrocities they wrought upon bystanders and future generations? For Geb, these topics must have been of no concern, as he and Nex escalated their struggles over hundreds of years. This war would not end until one side was destroyed or vanished. In 576 AR, Archmage Nex retreated into his refuge, a demiplane he had created for his own personal safety. He never left it, and any of his followers who dared to enter it since then have also never returned. With their leader gone, the nation feared this meant a victory for Geb. However, Geb ceased his hostilities and retreated his forces. The war between Nex and Geb was over. What remained were the mana wastes, a land so ravaged by remnant magic it remains a danger to this day, and the sorrow of the countless victims that fell to this 1,000-year clash of egos and pride. Geb, having lost his greatest rival, changed on that day. Who else was left in this existence to challenge him? Who could push him to seek out new secrets, develop new levels of mastery, and prove that there were none greater than Geb? To a man with such a desire to prove his own superiority, having no more worthy foes to beat, drained the life from him. In 632 AR, the necromancer king took his own life. The man who had mastered the secrets of the boundary between being and not being thought that this would be the end of his story. Perhaps, somewhere deep down, Geb knew some desires transcend death. Some desires are so strong, they drag a soul back to life, whether it wants to or not. In his studies of undeath, he must have learned that unfulfilled wants, especially those felt at the moment of one's death, are one of the factors at play in the manifestation of ghosts. Returning as a ghost in his city of Meketar was then perhaps not a great surprise to Geb. Some sources say that Geb does not remember why he died and what caused him to return. A man who mastered so many secrets of death in life now finds his mind befuddled by crossing the threshold? It sounds impossible, yet also like an ironic prank of fate. Over the coming millennia, Geb would search for even the smallest signs of Nexus' return, while slowly transforming his country more and more into the undead state we know it as today. Many of his followers would transcend into undeath, vowing loyalty to their ghost king, and other nations, even those far away from the impossible lands, would watch these events with wary eyes. Of what concern these nations were to Geb himself is unclear, but one can assume that his focus was split between other priorities. Shackled to Meketar, he did not have the freedom of movement he had in life. Furthermore, he must have been aware that what kept him in this form was his unconcluded business with Nex. But how could that be concluded if there was no sign of the return of his rival? Geb sought distraction in the daily trials of ruling a nation and waited for new challenges to arise. One of these challenges would manifest in the year 3889 AR. After the Shining Crusade against Tar-Baphon, the new generations of the Knights of Ozem idolized their predecessors and how valiantly they fought against the Whispering Tyrant. Though the young nation of Lastwall and surrounding areas had enough undead threats to still be eliminated, some ambitious knights hungered for a chance to destroy a great undead like Tar-Baphon. When word of Geb's growing influence reached Commander Cladius Barronmore, he ordered his finest knights, including his grandson Amaretos, on an ambitious mission to infiltrate Meketar and destroy the Ghost King. To the Knights of Ozem, it must have sounded like a chance to immortalize their names in the annals of their order, a quest greater than any task left for them in Lastwall. The mission was an utter failure. The knights were easily defeated, and Geb took this as an insult. Did the world truly think a handful of would-be heroes from a distant land was enough to end his existence? A clear message had to be sent in response. Geb knew that the knights hailed from Lastwall, and its capital city of Vigil harbored the remains of Erasni, fallen herald of Eredon. The Ghost King raised the knights who came to slay him as grave knights, and sent them back to Vigil with a mission to retrieve Erasni's corpse and bring it to him. Geb would continue this desecration by, over the course of a year and a day, retrieve Erasni's soul from the great beyond, torture and wreck her mind, and ultimately turning her into a lich and official ruler of the nation of Geb against her will. The depravity of these actions is staggering and utterly reprehensible, and it illustrates Geb's contempt and lack of empathy for the world around him. Here is a man who has nothing else to exist for, yet the laws of a phenomenon he considers himself a master of keep him bound to this world, and from this bewildering paradox is perhaps born a resentment for oneself, which is projected upon the world with horrible consequences. Leaving the daily affairs of rulership to Erasni and his bloodlords, any threat to the kingdom is easily swept away by Geb himself. In 4329 AR, the warrior women of Holomag attempt to invade the country, but Geb turned the attackers into stone and bombarded the capital of their nation with magic and ruin. These feats sound impressive, but to Geb, they were not more than what a cantrip is to a young wizard. Every year of his ghostly and bound existence must have brought more self-pity and hatred to him, and one can only imagine how this would, at some point, escape from Geb's darkened heart and become the downfall of the world that kept him prisoner. However, in 4719 AR, something happened that changed everything. The flesh forges of Nex are horrifying, building-sized artifacts capable of creating a variety of monstrosities. Nex himself created them during his war with Geb, but when the Archmage vanished, these abomination factories shut down and remained dormant. However, around 4719 AR, the flesh forges sprang to life, spewing forth new creations that wandered off into the mana wastes. To many, this was a sign of evil, a portent of more horrors to come. To Geb, it was a spark of life he had not felt in thousands of years. The Ghost King was sure that the reanimation of the flesh forges meant that the return of his nemesis was imminent, almost forgetting that, around the same time, Erasni had fled from Geb and started to break the chains that bound her. Geb assumed direct control of his country, in preparation for the times ahead. Nex will soon be here. Of that Geb is sure, and he and his nation must be ready for that glorious day. Thank you very much for watching this summary of Geb's life and unlife. Have you used Geb in your stories, or have opinions about his character? Sound off in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and bye-bye.